Welcome to the German Historical Institute's Statistics for Historians course with Dr. Luke Blaxall from the University of Oxford and Dr. Caspar Bielan from the Turing Institute. In this first unit, I'm going to be introducing statistics for historians.
So why should a historian study statistics? Somewhat flippantly, we could say that to describe and analyse human society as it existed in the past, we inevitably make use of numbers and quantities, whether it is age, wealth, the size of groups in a population, political indicators, or economic data. Very often, we want to sort our objects of historical inquiry, for example people, into groups, for example middle class and working class, men and women, liberals and conservatives. And the natural follow-up, whenever we talk in terms of groups, is how large those groups were relative to each other. For example, a statement such as the working class supported the Labour Party, we can only objectively discern the truth of that statement by calculating the numbers that did support it. Judgments of this kind are incredibly common, and it is difficult to read a paragraph from a secondary or primary historical source without encountering at least some word that implies some kind of quantitative analysis. Usually, normally, often, many, significant, slightly, all of these terms that one will see in historical texts all imply some kind of quantitative judgment. And very often on those judgments, which often aren't really fully explained or backed up with statistics or data, whole arguments, theses, and hypotheses can stand and fall. A historian who is interested in statistics is simply more interested in more forensically analysing the basis of the many quantitative judgments that are inevitably part and parcel of historical research and writing. Without reprising the very long and complex debate here in detail, it can be said that from the 1980s, historians tended to become much more humanities scholars and much less social scientists, and as a consequence, the interest in quantitative history declined. Accordingly, it is only very seldom part of undergraduate history teaching to learn statistical methods or quantitative history. Sometimes, the lack of mathematics in history is given as a positive reason for studying the subject itself in the first place. Accordingly, it would certainly be no exaggeration to say that the study of statistics for historians and the number of historians that use quantitative techniques outside of economic history is much smaller than it was in the past, and the area is hardly fashionable. However, there are some very strong arguments for developing a basic statistical literacy and the ability to use statistics in your work as a historian, even if you don't really understand the mathematics underlying it. I think there are the following key benefits. The first is that whether you're using text mining or whether you're using any statistical data, you can communicate quantity much more clearly. Being able to go beyond simple percentages and ratios to talk, for example, about statistical significance and correlations, give you a suite of extremely useful descriptive tools to be able to describe your data with much greater precision and authority. For example, the ability not just to show that lower turnouts may have been correlated with conservative vote share in the late Victorian period, but to describe the strength of that correlation, or to be able to show whether there is a statistically significant difference between how highly a group of 1,000 men and a group of 1,000 women rank the issue of education as a priority for government spending. Next, and perhaps more powerfully, there are possibilities for new areas of analysis. For example, through regression, which is a statistical measure of the relationship between, for example, the mean value of one variable, e.g. output, and the corresponding values of other variables, for example time and cost. With that relationship statistically established, it then can be possible to predict further readings. For example, in this case, what would the output be for a hypothetical time and cost? While the ability to make these kind of predictions tends to be more useful for those who are interested in predicting the future, they can also be very useful to historians as well, because very often historians don't have full data population samples. You may only have a portion of the overall data and want to be able to predict what hypothetical scenarios would be likely to be. Other than these boons of description and analysis, another major incentive for learning statistics for a historian can, I think, be the ability to interact with social and political science papers. Very often, especially for modern historians, for example, of politics or of gender, there will be other papers and research outputs that are published on very similar topics, but studied rather differently in the domain of social and political science. And being able to read these papers, to be able to understand them and the basis of how they're arguing, the techniques that they're using, can be tremendously important to be able to cite this research in your own papers where it's relevant, or indeed to make your own papers digestible and potentially interesting to these potentially interested audiences outside your field. Now, more specifically, and thinking about this course as a companion to the Text Mining for Historians course, statistics are very useful and I would even say essential to a text miner. The reason for this is because text mining obviously produces numerical results, where there are very often comparative groups. And you naturally want to be able to understand and describe the output of your text mining operations. Further, you can also return to the results of your text mining and potentially make it more robust by using various statistical techniques. For example, building a model where you control for other variables and thus can perhaps lean more heavily on the results of your text mining without being accused of not taking into account confounding variables. Finally, there are naturally some text mining techniques, some of the more sophisticated ones, like topic modeling and supervised classification, which are built upon mathematical modeling, and consequently, it makes a great deal of sense to understand at least the basics of analytical mechanisms that you are relying on. Now, I should end this brief introduction with a few words of what I would call pragmatism, which are things that I have observed from working in this field for some years. That will perhaps make things a little bit easier, or for those of you who haven't studied statistics before, a little bit less off-putting. The first is that the ability to set up and particularly interpret a statistical analysis is much more important than actually understanding the mathematics itself. Indeed, the mathematics of many text mining analytical paradigms, like topic modeling, is extremely complicated, and you probably have to be a specialist in mathematics to understand much about it. Even something like significance, for example, it isn't really necessary to understand the nature of a distribution curve. It's more necessary to understand in broad terms what it means, and then to understand how other scholars in fields which are statistical tend to use them. This is naturally a lot easier. The second point is a related one, but it's to try to appreciate how statistics are used to argue in different disciplines. Now, this isn't so much a question of specialist training, it's more a question of learning statistics so that you can interact with, for example, social science papers, and then thus begin to appreciate how statistics are deployed in this kind of context? What are the argumentative paradigms? How are models used? How are variables controlled for? Appreciating this social scientific paradigm will not only allow you to interact with these papers a lot more easily, but it will also throw into sharp relief how these papers are different from historical papers, and thus illustrate what you don't need to do, corners that you can cut, things that you can get away with that you probably wouldn't be able to get away with in a pure social scientific paper. Indeed, it will become quite obvious where the historian would want to dive down into a close reading analysis. A social scientist will revisit their model and potentially make a variable more robust, or become sidetracked into a debate about statistical minutiae. And then from that comes my third point of pragmatism, which is an understanding of where to use statistical analysis in historical work and where not to. You can be more omnivorous and more strategic as a historian. Maybe you start with a high-level discussion and produce a hypothesis before diving into some statistical analysis, but then breaking away once you've established a trend to some further close reading analysis. Ultimately, it's about discovering a voice that works for you and the kind of history that you are researching, which might be a blend of qualitative and quantitative techniques, neither dogmatically one or the other. Sometimes a statistical analysis might lead your work, but on many other occasions it might exist in a supplementary capacity. The fourth point of pragmatism is, I think, to appreciate that when you use statistical techniques, whether it's for text mining or indeed anything else as a historian outside of economic history, you are probably going to be publishing before an audience who is unstatistical or relatively unlikely to have been trained in statistics, probably has a natural skepticism of statistical methods, and is likely to want explanations of statistical techniques, especially when you're using other people's algorithms. Anything that looks a little bit black box-like, they won't simply accept the authority of published sources. They will want to have things explained to them so they understand them. Now, when you publish before an audience like this, it's much more necessary, even if you're a very sophisticated statistical analyst, to explain things a lot more deliberately, to use a lot more examples, and to not rely upon authority. Of course, it's certainly true that this can make quantitative history difficult to write, given the nature of that audience. But nonetheless, the rewards, whether analytical or descriptive, are, I think, worth it.